Even soldiers lose their way. He was once an army medic, Sergeant Mason Cole, a man who saved countless lives on battlefields half a world away. But one explosion took everything: his wife, his purpose, his faith. Years later, buried in the snow-covered streets of Denver, he lives unseen, his only companion, a loyal German shepherd named Ranger. Then one night, a little girl runs into the storm, begging him to save her mother. That single plea pulls Mason back into a fight he thought was over, a fight for life, for redemption, and for the miracles God hides in the cold. Because sometimes the bravest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with mercy. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. Denver lay frozen beneath a sky the color of pewter, the kind of cold that gnawed through glass and bone alike. Snow hissed against the marble facade of Redstone Technologies, a tower of mirrored windows and sleepless ambition. Inside the lobby, the scent of polished floors and expensive perfume mingled with the hollow murmur of executives crossing between elevators. It was a world of order, of clean shoes and controlled voices, until the front doors burst open. A blast of wind carried in a flurry of snow and a child's voice. "Help! Please! Someone help!" The echo snapped through the air like a crack of lightning. Heads turned. Phones paused mid-air. Conversations died. Through the gust staggered a little girl, no more than 6 years old. Her name was Emma Collins, and the sight of her silenced the room. She was small and trembling, wrapped in a thin white dress that clung to her knees, her boots soaked dark with melted snow, her hair, a pale chestnut, stuck to her tear-wet cheeks. The ribbon that once held it had come loose, fluttering like a wounded bird. She looked like a ghost out of a snowstorm, except for the fire in her wide green eyes. The security guard at the front desk, a broad-shouldered man named Vince Morales, started forward. "Miss, are you lost?" he asked, his tone soft but cautious, his hand already hovering near the radio on his shoulder. He was used to dealing with lobby intrusions, protesters, paparazzi, sometimes confused visitors, but never a child like this. Emma shook her head violently. "They hurt my mom!" she gasped, her breath steaming in the cold air. "She's bleeding, and she won't wake up." The words tumbled out, wild and sharp, like stones rolling downhill. Vince froze. "Who hurt your mom?" But Emma wasn't listening. Her gaze had already locked onto someone else, a man standing by the far wall with a mop and a gray bucket. He looked out of place even here, even now, as if the entire world had forgotten he existed. His name was Mason Cole, and for 3 years he had been the invisible spine of this building, the quiet custodian who arrived before dawn and left long after everyone else. He was in his late 30s, tall but slightly stooped, as if carrying invisible weight on his shoulders. His face was all sharp planes and weathered edges, framed by a few days' stubble that silvered at the chin. His hair, once dark, had begun to gray around the temples. The scars on his knuckles told a story no resume ever could. He wore his uniform like armor, his movements deliberate, silent. Those who spoke to him, if they ever did, described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who nodded instead of smiled. At his side sat a German shepherd, steady and alert, its coat a mix of sable and smoke. The dog's name was Ranger, 7 years old, trained once for service but retired after a bomb blast in Kandahar left him deaf in one ear and limping slightly on his right hind leg. Mason had adopted him after the war. They had saved each other, though neither of them would ever say it aloud. "Mr. Mason." Emma's voice cracked. She ran past the startled guard and flung herself against Mason's leg, gripping his uniform with both tiny hands. "Please, you have to help. My mom. She's down there. She's hurt. She's not moving." For a second, Mason didn't move. The mop handle trembled faintly in his grip. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something deep flickered there, a buried instinct snapping awake. That soldier's clarity he thought he'd buried under layers of silence and time. The memory of sirens in the desert, of blood on sand, of voices calling for medics in the dark. He crouched to meet her gaze. "Where is she, sweetheart?" His voice was low, even, the kind of voice people listened to without question. "The garage," Emma sobbed. "Two men, masks, they hurt her, and then they ran." "Ranger," Mason said quietly. The shepherd straightened, muscles tensing under his coat, eyes fixed on the girl as if reading her fear. "Stay with me," Mason told Emma, rising to his full height. "Show me." Vince moved to block him. "Sir, wait. Let security handle this." Mason's eyes met his, steady and sharp. "You'll need to call the police and paramedics," he said. "But if she's unconscious, those minutes matter." There was authority in his tone, the kind that came from command, not arrogance. Vince hesitated, then lifted the radio. Mason was already moving. Ranger fell into step beside him, silent but alert, tail straight like a line of focus. Emma ran ahead toward the elevator, her breath hitching. The descent to the sub-level was a quiet made of dread. The elevator hummed. Emma stood between Mason and Ranger, clutching the dog's thick fur as though it were a rope holding her above fear. Mason's reflection in the steel doors looked like another man entirely, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. It had been 8 years since he'd worn the patch of the Army Medical Corps. 8 years since a roadside bomb had taken both his unit and his wife in the same explosion. That day had broken something in him, something he'd buried under silence, night shifts, and the endless rhythm of mops and floors. But the moment Emma had cried his name, all those walls had cracked. When the doors opened, cold air swept in. The garage was half lit, the sound of distant engines muffled by snow. A paper trail glimmered across the concrete. Forms scattered, a briefcase torn open, ink bleeding into ice. Mason followed the trail until he saw her. Grace Collins, the CEO of Redstone Technologies, lay motionless near a parked sedan. She was a woman in her mid-30s, tall, with chestnut hair now streaked with blood and frost. Her tailored coat was torn at the shoulder, and her left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Her face, usually composed, commanding, was pale, lips tinged blue. She looked powerful even in collapse, like a queen brought down from her throne. Mason knelt beside her. His fingers found her pulse, weak but present. "Still breathing," he murmured. "Good." He turned to Emma. "Stay behind Ranger, don't look." Ranger sat squarely beside the girl, chest rising steady, a sentinel against fear. Mason's hands moved without thought. Jacket off, folded beneath Grace's head. He checked pupils, uneven, skull trauma, abdomen, rigid, possible internal bleeding. The old training took over. The world narrowed to breaths, pressure, seconds. "Come on," he whispered, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. "Stay with me." Emma's small voice trembled behind him. "Is she gonna die?" Mason didn't look back. "Not tonight." The wail of sirens rose faintly from above. Relief flickered, but he didn't stop. He adjusted her position, used his jacket to cover her against shock, spoke to her softly as though she could hear. "You've got a little girl upstairs waiting for you. Don't make her wait too long." When the paramedics arrived, they found him still kneeling there, his gray uniform stained with blood, the dog at his side, the child holding Ranger's tail like a lifeline. One of the medics, a woman named Carla Diaz, dark hair in a braid, eyes sharp and kind, took one look and frowned. "Who did the first aid?" "I did," Mason replied simply. She blinked at the field dressings, the perfect placement of splints, the control of bleeding. "Military?" Mason met her eyes. "Once." Ranger let out a soft whine as they lifted Grace onto the stretcher. Emma clung to Mason's sleeve. "You're coming too, right?" Mason hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm coming." Outside, snow kept falling, white, endless, merciless, and for the first time in years, Mason Cole walked back into a world where every heartbeat mattered again. The blizzard outside had thickened into a white curtain, swallowing Denver's streets in silence. In the underground parking lot of Redstone Technologies, the world felt suspended. The hum of fluorescent lights, the sharp smell of gasoline, the faint metallic echo of boots against concrete. Mason Cole knelt beside Grace Collins as if the rest of time had ceased to exist. Her pulse flickered beneath his fingers, fragile but still there, the soft rhythm of a heart refusing to give in. He had seen that kind of fight before, the stubborn insistence of life against impossible odds. Ranger sat beside him, posture tense, ears twitching at every sound from the shadows. The dog's breath came out in short bursts, visible in the cold. Mason spoke softly to him without looking up. "Watch our six, buddy." The paramedics finally burst through the door, 2 men and a woman in heavy parkas. The woman, Carla Diaz, stepped forward first. She was in her late 30s, short and solidly built, her black braids swinging against the reflective stripes of her jacket. Her face bore the kind of calm that only comes from years of chaos. "Denver EMS," she called. "What's the situation?" Mason met her gaze briefly. "Severe head trauma, possible internal bleeding, fractured arm. Breathing shallow but steady. I stabilized what I could." Carla knelt, her practiced eyes scanning the dressings, the splints, the way Grace's body was positioned. "You did all this?" she asked, more statement than question. "I used to do this for a living," Mason said, his tone flat but not defensive. She nodded slowly. "You kept her alive." Then turning to her team, she barked orders. "Let's get her on oxygen. Watch the neck. On my count. 1, 2, lift." As the stretcher rolled toward the elevator, Emma tugged at Mason's sleeve. Her little fingers were shaking, eyes wide and full of confusion. "Is she going to be okay?" Mason crouched down, meeting her gaze. The reflection of emergency lights flickered across her tear-streaked cheeks. "She's strong," he said quietly. "She just needs time." Carla looked between them, something soft flickering in her eyes. "We can take one family member in the ambulance." "I'll ride with her," Mason said. Carla frowned slightly. "Are you family?" Emma looked up at him, clutching his arm. "He helped her. Please." That was enough. Carla nodded. "Fine. Let's move." The ride to St. Mary's Medical Center was a blur of sirens and red lights reflecting against snow. Mason sat silently in the corner. Ranger pressed close to his knee. Grace lay between them, her face pale beneath the oxygen mask. The rhythmic beep of the monitor filled the ambulance, a steady reminder that she was still there. Mason watched her chest rise and fall, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding back something more than fear. When they arrived, A team of doctors and nurses swarmed. A tall physician in his 50s, Dr. Leonard Grayson, took charge. He was a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes to match, the kind that had seen too many emergencies to waste a word. Possible subdural hematoma, internal bleeding, left radius fracture, Carla reported. Dr. Grayson nodded briskly. Prep the OR. Let's keep the kid outside. He turned to Mason. Who are you? Just someone who found her, Mason said. Dr. Grayson looked at the military-grade trauma kit still strapped across Mason's chest and arched an eyebrow. That's not a janitor's toolkit. Mason didn't answer. Ranger growled softly under his breath, a low warning. Grayson raised a hand in apology and stepped back. All right. Thank you for getting her here alive. We'll take it from here. Hours passed in the hospital corridor. Mason sat on a plastic chair, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor tiles. Emma had fallen asleep against Ranger's side, one small hand buried in the dog's thick fur. Ranger didn't move except to rest his head protectively across her lap. The rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing seemed to steady Mason more than the sterile hum of the hospital ever could. Carla appeared again, holding 2 cups of coffee. You look like you've been through a war, she said. Mason gave a humorless smile. You're not far off. She sat beside him, handing him one of the cups. So what's your story, soldier? He hesitated. Army medic, 10 years. I quit after we lost a convoy in Helmand Province. My wife was on that transport. She was a nurse. Carla's expression softened. I'm sorry. Yeah. Mason stared at the steam curling from the cup. After that, I decided I'd done enough saving lives for one lifetime. And yet here you are, she said quietly. Before Mason could answer, the operating room doors swung open. Dr. Grayson emerged, removing his mask. His expression was tired but calm. She made it through surgery, he said. A few broken ribs, a concussion, but she's lucky. If whoever treated her hadn't kept her stable, she wouldn't have made it. Carla smiled faintly. You hear that? Mason exhaled, shoulders sagging with relief he didn't let himself show. When can she see her daughter? Tomorrow morning, Grayson said. We'll keep her under observation tonight. Mason nodded. Thank you. When Emma stirred, Mason knelt beside her. Your mom's going to be okay, he said softly. Emma blinked sleepily, then smiled, weak but real. You saved her. He shook his head. She saved herself. I just helped her remember how. Later that night, Mason stood outside the hospital beneath the falling snow. The city lights painted halos in the mist. Ranger sat beside him, tail brushing the slush. Mason looked down at the dog. You did good today, old man. Ranger's ears flicked. Mason scratched behind them, his hand trembling slightly. We weren't supposed to do this anymore, he murmured. We were done. But even as he said it, he knew that was a lie. Behind him, Carla stepped out with her coat zipped to her chin. You disappearing after this? That was the plan, he said. She studied him for a moment. That little girl in there thinks you're a hero. Maybe stick around long enough to prove her right. Mason looked toward the glowing hospital windows. Somewhere inside, Grace Collins was breathing steady again. The snow fell thicker, muffling the world. Ranger gave a quiet huff, pressing against Mason's leg as if urging him to stay. For the first time in years, Mason didn't walk away. Morning came slow over Denver, a thin line of gold slicing through the gray clouds that had buried the city for days. The snow outside St. Mary's Medical Center had hardened overnight, now a crust of ice reflecting the pale winter sun. Inside, Everything smelled of antiseptic and quiet fear. Machines hummed softly, nurses whispered in the hall, and in room 214, Grace Collins opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that her throat burned and her body ached like she had fallen through glass. Then memory came rushing back. The parking garage, the footsteps, the pain, the flash of a man's hand striking her face, and the voice, low, urgent, demanding. "Where are the files?" Grace tried to speak, but her lips were dry. Her left arm was wrapped in a cast. Her ribs ached with every breath. She turned her head slightly and saw her daughter. Emma Collins, still in her little white coat, was asleep in a chair beside the bed, head resting on Ranger's side. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Grace's movement, one brown eye opening to check on her before he settled again. There was blood still dried on his fur from the night before. Grace's vision blurred, emotion pressing behind her eyes. She reached weakly toward her daughter, touching her hair. "Baby," she whispered. Emma stirred, blinking. When she saw her mother awake, she gasped and threw her arms around her gently. "Mom, you're okay." Grace winced but smiled through it. "Hey, sweetheart, you found help?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Mr. Mason saved you, he and Ranger." She pointed toward the door. "He stayed all night outside with Ranger. He didn't even leave when it snowed again." Grace's brow furrowed. "Mason?" Before Emma could answer, a knock came at the door. Detective Ryan Hale stepped in, a man who carried the scent of coffee and long nights. He was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, his black coat dusted with melting snow. His face was all edges and exhaustion, with the faint shadow of stubble and deep lines carved from years of seeing too much. There was kindness in his eyes, but it was buried under the weight of experience. His voice, low and rough, carried authority softened by empathy. "Miss Collins," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "I'm Detective Hale with Denver PD. How are you feeling?" "Like I lost a fight with a brick wall," Grace muttered. "But I'll live." Hale managed a faint smile. "Good to hear. I need to ask you some questions about what happened." Grace nodded slowly. Two men. Ski masks. They came out of nowhere. Her throat tightened as she spoke. "One of them knew me, or at least knew my work. They kept demanding files, backup reports. I think it was about the company's finances." "Redstone Technologies?" Hale asked, flipping through his notes. "We already pulled some leads. You mentioned files. Any idea what they wanted?" Grace hesitated. "There's been irregularities, numbers that don't line up, transfers I didn't authorize. I was planning to confront our CFO, Ethan Brandt, at the next board meeting." At the mention of the name, Hale's eyes sharpened. "Brandt, the board's golden boy, right?" Grace nodded. "He's been with the company since my father's time. I trusted him." "Do you still?" Grace didn't answer. She just looked at her daughter, then away. Hale understood silence better than lies. He closed his notebook. "We'll start there." He was about to leave when Mason appeared at the door. He wasn't wearing his janitor's uniform anymore, just a dark flannel shirt, jeans, and his old army jacket, edges frayed from years of wear. He looked cleaner than he had the night before, but the lines of fatigue still marked his face. There was something unreadable in his expression, a calm that felt earned through years of chaos. Ranger trotted over, tail wagging faintly. Mason scratched behind his ears before stepping forward. "You're awake," he said simply. Grace studied him, the quiet confidence, the way he carried himself. Not just a janitor, a soldier. There was a steadiness in his movements, even when he stood still. "You saved my life," she said softly. "I did what anyone would do," he replied. "No," she said, shaking her head slowly. "You did what a trained medic would do. The doctors said I wouldn't have made it without you." Mason didn't respond. He didn't know what to do with gratitude. "You should rest. The police have it from here." Before Grace could speak again, Hale turned toward Mason. "You're the one who treated her?" Mason nodded. Hale eyed him carefully. "We ran your name this morning. Staff Sergeant Mason Cole, U.S. Army medic, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Honorable discharge after your wife, Captain Emily Cole, was killed in Kabul." The words hit the room like a drop of lead. Grace's breath caught. Emma looked between them, confused. Mason's jaw tightened. "You did your homework?" "It's my job," Hale said, his tone gentler than before. "I just wanted to say, what you did last night was extraordinary. Most people freeze in a crisis. You didn't." "I've had practice," Mason said quietly. Hale nodded. "Well, I could use someone who keeps his head under pressure." Mason frowned. "I'm not a cop." "Didn't say you were. But whoever went after Ms. Collins isn't done. She's the only one who can expose them, and they'll know she survived. We could use your eyes. And your dog." Grace looked from Hale to Mason. "You think they'll try again?" "People who steal millions don't like leaving loose ends," Hale said. "Until we find Brandt or whoever he's working with, you're in danger." Silence stretched between them. Mason's gaze dropped to Emma, who clutched Ranger's fur, her eyes wide with unspoken trust. He exhaled. "Oh, fine. I'll stay until she's safe." Later that afternoon, Grace sat by the window as snow drifted outside. She felt the weight of exhaustion, but also something steadier, resolve. She had spent years building Redstone from her father's legacy, fighting boardrooms, investors, and deadlines. But this was different. This was survival, and she wasn't alone. Downstairs, Mason waited in the hospital lobby. Ranger lay beside his boots, tail thumping lightly each time a nurse passed. Mason stared at the exit, watching snow swirl beyond the glass. He could still leave. He could walk out, disappear into the white again, go back to being invisible. But something about the little girl's eyes and her mother's quiet strength held him there. He leaned forward, whispering to the dog, "Guess we're not done fighting shadows yet, huh?" Ranger looked up, one ear twitching, and Mason smiled faintly. The first real smile in years. The snow that winter came early, blanketing Denver in silence, as if the city itself needed to pause after months of chaos. 3 weeks had passed since Ethan Brandt, the fallen CFO of Redstone Technologies, was led away in handcuffs. The investigation had peeled back layers of deceit, embezzlement, money laundering, hired men. Grace had survived the attack. Her company had survived the scandal. But Mason Cole knew that survival and healing were not the same thing. He had spent years hiding from purpose, sweeping hallways, fixing leaky pipes, existing instead of living. Now Grace wanted to give him something dangerous: hope. They met again at her home on the western edge of Denver, a modest 2-story house with a view of the mountains and a small yard where snow gathered on the fence posts. Grace greeted him at the door, her left arm still in a brace but her posture firm. The warmth from the fireplace inside made her pale skin glow faintly. She wore no makeup, her auburn hair tied loosely at her nape, and though her face bore the faint scars of the attack, her eyes had regained their sharpness, the kind of gaze that had once made boardrooms go quiet. "Mason," she said, smiling softly, "come in before you freeze." He stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. Ranger padded close behind him, shaking off flakes, tail sweeping the air. Grace led him to the living room. On the coffee table lay a folder filled with architectural sketches and handwritten notes. "I want to build something," she said. "Not another corporate empire. Something that matters. A community medical center for people who can't afford help. Veterans, single mothers, the homeless. You'd run it." Mason froze. "I'm not a doctor anymore." Grace tilted her head. "You didn't stop being a healer just because you stopped wearing the uniform. I let my license expire 8 years ago." "Then renew it," she said simply. "I'll handle the funding, the permits, the logistics. You just need to say yes." He looked at her, the firelight flickering across his worn face. "I don't deserve that kind of trust." Grace's smile faltered, but her tone remained steady. "Mason, I built my company on data and logic. But the night you saved me, that wasn't logic. That was grace. And it reminded me that the world doesn't need more businessmen. It needs people like you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ranger placed his paw on Mason's knee, as if casting the deciding vote. That night, Mason opened a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were his old field manuals, blood-stained notebooks, and a stethoscope engraved with his wife's name, Captain Emily Cole. He sat on the edge of his bed, Ranger resting his head on Mason's boot. "She would have loved this," Mason murmured. The following weeks were a blur of rebuilding. Grace, despite her injuries, threw herself into the project with relentless energy. She partnered with an architect named Lucas Reed, a soft-spoken man in his early 40s with sandy blonde hair and round glasses perpetually sliding down his nose. Lucas was tall and slightly awkward in conversation, but brilliant with designs that breathed warmth instead of sterility. He'd lost his brother, a Marine, to PTSD the previous year, his quiet motivation behind volunteering for the project. "People heal better in places that feel human," Lucas explained during one snowy afternoon, spreading blueprints across the table. "No cold walls, no fluorescent lights. Think wood, think sunlight." Grace nodded, impressed. Mason, though skeptical at first, found himself drawn into the planning sessions. He suggested small changes, triage rooms closer to the lobby for emergencies, ramps wide enough for stretchers, a small fenced yard where therapy dogs could play with children. Ranger, sitting nearby, barked approval at every mention of dogs. Word spread quickly. Volunteers came. Nurses, retired soldiers, local students. Among them was Tanya Kim, a petite woman in her late 20s, half Korean, with streaks of silver in her black hair that made her look older than she was. Tanya had worked as an EMT before quitting after losing a patient during a snowstorm. She joined Mason's team after seeing a flyer titled "Ranger Clinic, Help Us Heal Denver." Her laughter was contagious, her work ethic fierce, though Mason saw in her eyes the same ghost he carried: survivor's guilt. Under the relentless gray sky, the empty lot on the edge of Lincoln Street began to transform. Steel frames rose, windows glinted, heaters hummed against the cold. Mason worked every day alongside the crew, his calloused hands as steady with a hammer as they once had been with a scalpel. At night, he studied for his medical recertification exams, his mind haunted by images of Emily but steadied by the sound of Ranger's breathing beside him. Grace visited the site often, even when her doctor advised rest. Watching Mason give instructions to volunteers, his sleeves rolled up, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. One evening, As they walked across the nearly finished hallways, she said, "You know, we could have named it after you." He shook his head. "It's not about me." "Then who is it about?" Mason glanced down at Ranger, who trotted ahead, his paws echoing on the tile. "Him," he said. "He's the reason I didn't give up, the reason I came back." When the clinic finally opened, Denver's winter was at its fiercest. The sky was a washed-out silver, the air sharp enough to sting. But people came, veterans wrapped in worn coats, mothers holding sick children, teenagers with nowhere else to go. A line stretched down the block. Grace stood by the door, greeting each visitor. Mason and Tanya prepared the triage stations. Lucas adjusted a crooked sign that read, "Ranger Community Health Center, open to all." Ranger moved from person to person, tail wagging, leaning gently against anxious hands. Even the most guarded faces softened when he looked up at them. To many, he became the clinic's guardian spirit. As dusk fell, the crowd thinned. Mason stepped outside, exhaling into the cold air. Snowflakes clung to his lashes. Grace joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You did it," she said. He smiled faintly. "No, we did it." From inside, children's laughter echoed down the hall, followed by Ranger's playful bark. Mason looked toward the sound, his chest tight with something unfamiliar and good. Grace followed his gaze. "What's next for you, Sergeant Cole?" Mason stared at the horizon, where snow met sky. "Maybe redemption isn't something you find," he said softly. "Maybe it's something you build, one heartbeat at a time." Ranger nudged his hand, demanding attention, and Mason laughed, a deep, honest sound that startled even him. For the first time in 8 years, he didn't feel haunted by the past. He felt home. Winter had returned to Denver like a familiar ghost, soft, white, and patient. A full year had passed since the grand opening of Ranger Clinic, and in that time, the modest brick building had become more than a medical center. It was a beacon. Its windows glowed against the endless gray of the season, a warm pulse in the cold heart of the city. The people who once passed by without looking now came with smiles, donations, and homemade cookies wrapped in foil. Inside, the main hall buzzed with quiet celebration. Streamers hung from the ceiling, paper snowflakes cut by schoolchildren fluttered with every draft of warm air, and a banner read in bold red letters, "1 year of healing, thank you, Denver." A crowd had gathered, veterans in worn coats, families Mason once treated, volunteers, and neighbors who now called the place a second home. Mason Cole stood near the entrance, the man who once hid in janitorial shadows now dressed in a dark suit that still felt strange on his shoulders. The suit was simple, black with a faint sheen of wool, but on him it carried a kind of dignity that came not from fashion but from redemption. His hair was shorter now, streaks of gray more pronounced, and though his face bore the same weathered lines, they had softened, carved not by grief but by life lived again. Beside him, Ranger sat proudly, wearing a blue service vest embroidered with the clinic's logo. His coat gleamed in the light, thick and well-groomed, the gray around his muzzle giving him a wise, almost regal air. He was older now, 8 years old, but still alert, tail flicking, amber eyes calm and knowing. Children adored him, patients trusted him. To Mason, he was still the guardian that had led him back from the edge. Grace's voice broke through the hum of the room. "Everyone, if I could have your attention." She stood at the small podium, elegant in a deep navy dress that caught the light like silk waves. Her auburn hair fell loosely over her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with warmth. There was still a faint scar above her left brow, the only visible remnant of the night that had nearly stolen her life. But tonight, she stood radiant, strong, whole, free. Mason watched her with quiet pride as she spoke. "A year ago, this place was just an idea on a napkin," Grace said. "And now, because of you, because of our volunteers, our donors, our staff, it's become a home for so many who had none. We've treated over 2,000 patients this year, trained more than 100 students in first aid, and delivered 23 babies. But more than that, we've built something no storm can take away." Applause filled the hall, echoing like soft thunder. Emma ran up the aisle and hugged her mother's legs, before Grace laughed and lifted her into her arms. Emma Collins, now 7, had grown taller but kept the same bright, fearless eyes. She wore a red scarf that nearly swallowed her chin, a gift from Mason last Christmas. Ranger had pawed it open that morning, and Emma swore it meant luck. Grace set Emma down, and the girl darted toward Mason, grabbing Ranger's leash. "Come on, Mr. Mason. They said we can go outside after the speeches. There's snow." Mason chuckled. "Snow? In Denver? I'm shocked." Emma giggled, her breath puffing out in white clouds as the front doors opened. The world outside shimmered, snow falling in lazy spirals beneath the golden glow of the clinic lights. Standing near the door was Detective Ryan Hale, now off duty, wearing a heavy wool coat and his usual air of quiet amusement. His dark hair was streaked with more silver than the year before, and the faint scar along his jaw caught the light. He'd stayed in touch after the Brandt case closed, helping with security checks and background screenings for the clinic. Tonight, he held a mug of cocoa instead of coffee. "Place looks good, Cole," he said, nodding. "Didn't think I'd see you smiling this much when we first met." Mason grinned. "That makes 2 of us." Nearby, Tanya Kim arranged trays of food. She had grown more confident in her role as senior medic, her laughter often the loudest sound in the clinic. She wore her hair tied up, the silver streaks glinting like frost, her hands steady as ever. She caught Mason's eye and lifted a cup in silent toast. He returned the gesture. Lucas Reed, the architect who had designed the clinic, stood in the corner by a model of the building encased in glass. He was thinner now, his glasses fogging from the indoor heat, but there was pride in his smile as he watched the people milling about. "Looks better than my blueprints ever did," he said softly when Grace passed him. As the evening deepened, snow thickened outside. The world grew still again, save for laughter, music, and the muffled sound of boots on tile. Emma tugged Mason toward the entrance. "Come on! Mom said it's okay!" Mason followed her outside, Ranger bounding alongside. The courtyard was covered in a soft blanket of snow, reflecting the lights from the clinic windows. Mason looked up at the falling flakes, exhaling a slow breath that crystallized in the air. Grace stepped out behind him, wrapping her coat tighter around her shoulders. "You never stop working, do you?" she teased. He smiled. "Just making sure no one slips on the ice." She walked closer, her boots crunching softly against the snow. "You've built something beautiful, Mason." "We built it," he corrected gently. "You, me, Tanya, Lucas, and everyone who walked through those doors." Grace met his gaze, her voice softer now. "And what about you? You've spent so long fixing others. When do you let yourself heal?" Mason hesitated, glancing toward Emma, who was throwing snowballs at Ranger, both of them laughing in pure delight. He looked back at Grace, his voice low. "Maybe healing isn't about forgetting. It's about having someone to walk through the storm with. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. Only the snow, the lights, and their breath visible in the cold air. Then Emma turned and shouted, "Mr. Mason, you promised to show me how to whistle through my fingers." Mason chuckled, breaking the moment. A promise is a promise. He knelt beside her, showing her the trick, laughing when she made only a faint squeak. Inside, the music faded as the last of the guests began to leave. Ryan Hale waved goodbye. Tanya and Lucas cleaned up, and Grace stood in the doorway, watching Mason and Emma in the snow. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing a small velvet box she'd hidden there all evening. But before she could speak, Mason turned, kneeling before Emma. "Permission to ask your mom a question?" he asked, his breath visible in the freezing air. Emma's eyes widened, then sparkled. "Yes," she whispered. Ranger barked once, sharp and joyful, the sound echoing against the quiet streets. Mason turned to Grace, standing beneath the glow of the clinic sign, Ranger Clinic, hope in every season. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," Mason said softly, "but I can promise I'll be here, for you, for Emma, and for everyone we can still save." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, and she laughed, breath shaking. "Yes, Mason." As Ranger leaped up, tail wagging, snow swirled around them like confetti from heaven. Above the clinic doors, the lights flickered brighter for a moment, as if the building itself approved. Somewhere deep in the cold night, the sound of Ranger's joyful bark carried upward, a hymn to second chances. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles wrapped in thunder or lightning. Sometimes, He sends them quietly, in the shape of a soldier who refuses to give up, in the loyalty of a German shepherd who never leaves his master's side, and in the small hands of a child who believes love can heal even the deepest scars. Mason, Grace, Emma, and Ranger remind us that faith isn't about waiting for a sign from heaven. It's about becoming the sign for someone else. Each act of kindness, each moment we choose forgiveness over anger, each time we help a stranger, that's where God works His quiet wonders. Because miracles still walk among us. They wear work boots, wag their tails, and whisper hope into the cold. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs light today. Leave a comment below and tell us, where did you last see a miracle in your own life? And if you believe that love still conquers darkness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, redemption, and faith. May God bless you, keep you safe, and remind you, no matter how cold the season gets, His warmth always finds a way back into the human heart.